If the oldest cities we have ever uncovered were not built by humanity's first architects, but by its last survivors, imagine that possibility without rushing past it. Let it sit in the quiet part of your mind, the place that usually waits for sleep. Not as a claim, not as a conclusion, but as a doorway. Because some doors do not open with proof. They open with the shape of a question that refuses to go away. Across the world, behind museum glass, small objects lie under controlled light. They are not dramatic to the eye. They do not tower. They do not glitter. They do not pretend to be eternal. They are, in fact, almost humble palm-sized tablets of baked clay, fragments of dull stone, the soft geometry of wedge-shaped marks pressed into once wet earth. And yet, if you know what you are looking at, you begin to realize the frightening thing. These are not decorations. They are not early attempts. They are not the clumsy first stammer of civilization trying to learn how to speak. They are records. They are accounting. They are the shape of a system that already knows what it is doing. A tablet does not need to be beautiful to be lethal. A tablet only needs to be durable. And clay cheap, common clay becomes, once fired, one of the most stubborn carriers of memory humanity ever discovered. Water cannot easily erase it. Fire, oddly enough, can preserve it. Time buries it, but time also shelters it. A broken tablet can still be read. Even a fragment can still whisper. So when we ask where civilization began, we should first ask a different question. What kind of civilization writes as if it already remembers? The river plains of southern Mesopotamia are not generous. They are fertile, yes, but they are also dangerous. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates is a place where water behaves like a god. It gives, it withdraws, and sometimes it returns without warning. The ground can be flat for miles, the sky a pale bowl of heat, and the horizon on certain afternoons turns into a mirage that looks like another world hovering just above this one. In the late 19th century, archaeologists came there expecting beginnings. They came looking for primitive foundations, rough villages, slow steps forward. They expected to see humanity learning, stumbling into writing, stumbling into math, stumbling into urban life like a child learning to walk. Instead, they found cities. Not just settlements, not just clusters of huts. Cities with planning, cities with drainage, cities with street grids aligned in ways that look less like improvisation and more like blueprint. Temples oriented with a relationship to the sky. Bureaucratic systems that require standardization. And then, beneath those cities, in certain places, something else. Sterile layers of river silt, thick and uniform, like a pause written into the earth. A pause. A gap. A line separating before from after. Archaeology is often patient. It is trained to see gradual change. It expects pottery styles to evolve, tools to refine, structures to become more complex over time. It is comfortable with the idea of progress. But sometimes the ground tells a different story. Sometimes it tells you that something ended. In certain excavated sites Kish, Shuruppak archaeologists found flood deposits. Not a thin smear. Not a single muddy season. Layers that suggested an event large enough to interrupt life, cover living floors, bury streets, erase the normal continuity of occupation. The details differ from site to site because floods are not fair. They do not distribute their weight evenly. In some places the silt was thick. In others it was absent. That inconsistency is exactly what makes the geology believable. It suggests a regional catastrophe, not a mythic ocean swallowing the entire world. And yet, in the memory of the people who lived there, the flood became more than regional. It became a boundary. It became a before and after strong enough to organize time itself. Because the strange thing is not just the flood layers. The strange thing is what came after. Above the flood strata, in the layers dated to early dynastic summer, the civilization does not look like a newborn. It looks like a survivor. It looks like something reassembled quickly with an urgency that is hard to explain if no memory existed. The writing appears standardized. The mathematics appears confident. The administrative tone appears mature. And if you listen closely, if you read the ancient texts not as myth, but as the psychological shadow of a people who believed they were inheriting something, and then you begin to notice a repeated obsession. Restoration, not invention. Restoration. Kings boasting not that they created, but that they returned things to how they were before. Temples rebuilt again and again on the same foundation, keeping the same alignment, the same sacred geometry, as if the layout itself mattered more than the bricks. A civilization that behaves like it is maintaining a template, as if the template came from somewhere else. This is where the clay tablets become unsettling, because they do not just tell stories. They do not just sing hymns to gods. They keep track. They measure. They calculate. They schedule. They describe the movement of planets. And that kind of knowledge is slow to build. It requires continuity. It requires generations of stable observation. It requires calm. So why does it appear in the record with so little visible apprenticeship? In a quiet museum hall, far from the river plains, a small artifact sits behind reinforced glass. It is a prism of clay, a little taller than a bottle, covered on each side with dense columns of cuneiform signs. It is known today by a modern name, the Well-Blundell Prism, but the scribes who wrote it did not need a name. To them it was simply a list. A king list. A list sounds harmless. A list sounds like boring bureaucracy. But this list begins with a sentence that refuses to behave like metaphor. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an heir due. It does not say people chose a king. It does not say a strong man rose. It says kingship descended. And then it does something even stranger. It divides rulers into two categories: those who ruled before the flood and those who ruled after. The pre-flood kings reign for lengths that look impossible, tens of thousands of years, numbers so extreme that modern readers often treat them as symbolic or erroneous. Perhaps they are. Perhaps they encode dynasties, or clans, or celestial cycles, or a counting system misunderstood by later scribes. But the core structure is consistent. A long, expansive before, an abrupt flood, then a compressed after. Time itself seems to shrink. And this same pattern appears, in a different voice, in other ancient traditions that will later echo across the world. Lifespans long before a great deluge, shorter afterward. A world that used to be bigger not in landmass, but in the sense of possibility, then a world that becomes smaller, more regulated, more mortal. In Mesopotamian stories like Atrahasis, the flood is not merely punishment. It is a population correction, a reset, a restructuring, a decision to impose limits on lifespan, on fertility, on the chaos of human noise. And afterward, the gods step back. They do not vanish, but they withdraw. They become distant. The psychological texture of this is important, because a civilization that believes it is living in the after will behave differently than one that believes it is living in the beginning. It will measure, record, preserve. It will make archives. It will worry about loss. It will build not just for glory, but for endurance. And endurance is exactly what we see. Clay tablets survive because someone chose clay, because someone knew what water does, because someone had learned the lesson that memory dies when it lives only inside the living. This is why writing is not merely communication. It is external memory. It is the ability to make knowledge independent of a voice, independent of a body. It is the technology of survival. So let us return to the question that opened this door. What if the first cities we find are not the first cities that ever existed, but the first cities that were rebuilt after something ended? If that idea feels too large, bring it closer. Make it small enough to hold. Imagine a single scribe in a low room near a temple courtyard. It is evening. The heat has softened. Somewhere beyond the walls, water moves in the dark. The scribe's hands smell of clay. He presses a reed stylus into a tablet, making wedge marks with practiced confidence. He is not sketching. He is not experimenting. He is writing as if the system is already complete. He is documenting barley rations. He is recording land boundaries. He is copying a hymn. He is writing a list of kings. He is doing what you do when you are maintaining a world. And perhaps, if you are willing to imagine it, he is doing something else too. He is building a bridge over a gap he cannot describe. Because the unsettling thing about summer is not that it is ancient. The unsettling thing is how often it feels like a middle chapter. The Sumerian language itself deepens this discomfort. Unlike the neighboring Semitic languages, Sumerian does not clearly belong to a family we can trace. It stands alone, a linguistic isolate. Languages do not like to stand alone. They borrow, they evolve, they leave trails. But Sumerian appears in the record already capable of technical vocabulary, astronomy, metallurgy, law, administration, as if it arrived complete. A civilization that needs this kind of vocabulary is not a civilization that just learned it to count yesterday. And then there is the mathematics. One of the most famous old Babylonian tablets, known today by a catalog number, shows a square with diagonals and a number written in sexagesimal notation that corresponds to an approximation of the square root of 2, accurate to several decimal places. That is not the work of a culture that has just invented writing. That is the work of a culture with methods. The tablet does not show the steps. It simply gives the answer, as if the answer is already part of the mental furniture of the world. This pattern repeats. Astronomical records tracking Venus, calendars that stay aligned with seasons through intercalation, systems of measurement standardized across cities. And beneath all of it, the base, a 60 system. Why 60? Base of 10 is the obvious choice. Fingers, hands. Children can learn it. Most cultures gravitate toward it. 60 is not obvious. 60 is sophisticated. It is useful in ways you only appreciate once you are doing complex fractions, astronomy, geometry, trade. 60 divides cleanly by many numbers. It is flexible. It is a system that feels designed for a world that measures. We still live inside it. Our minutes, our seconds, our degrees of a circle, they are echoes of those ancient choices. If you are listening to this in the quiet, consider what it means to inherit a system you did not create. Consider what it means to use time like a tool passed down through catastrophe. Now, there is a temptation here, a temptation that many modern stories cannot resist. The temptation is to fill the gap with aliens, lost super civilizations, forbidden technology. But you do not need any of that to feel unsettled. You only need to accept the simplest possibility, that history, as we often imagine it, is too neat. That the path was not a straight line. That there were interruptions. That there were collapses. That there were people who rebuilt with trembling hands, trying to make the world function again, using whatever knowledge they could salvage. And if you accept that, then the oldest cities we find begin to look different. They stop looking like beginnings and start looking like restorations. Think of Eridu, often cited as one of the earliest urban centers in southern Mesopotamia. Excavations revealed multiple temple layers built one above another, each reconstruction keeping a relationship to the same sacred orientation, as if the location and alignment were not choices but obligations. The builders did not innovate the plan away. They repeated it. Repetition is not always a lack of imagination. Sometimes repetition is a vow. Sometimes repetition is what you do when you believe the pattern is older than you are, and breaking it might break the world. The same impulse appears in later Mesopotamian inscriptions, where kings describe rebuilding temples as before, returning them to an earlier condition. They speak like caretakers. Even the law codes speak in a way that feels like restoration law, presented as something received, authorized by the divine, not invented from scratch. And that brings us back to the flood, not as water, but as a metaphor for discontinuity. Because what a civilization fears most is not death. It is forgetting. If a flood can bury a city, it can bury a system. It can erase a chain of training, a tradition of measurement, the quiet continuity required for astronomy and administration. So if you lived in the after, and you had any sense that the world could pause again, you would write differently. You would archive. You would make duplicates. You would organize tablets by topic. You would store them in jars and bury them under floors. You would build libraries not as luxury, but as insurance. And that is what we see. In places like Nippur, in scribal quarters, tablets were stored carefully, sometimes sealed, sometimes labeled. In Nineveh, centuries later, kings amassed libraries, copying older texts, preserving them as if they belonged to a chain of memory too important to lose. This is the psychology of a civilization that has learned the terror of discontinuity. Now, take that psychology and widen it. If a flood tradition becomes a before and after in Mesopotamia, why do flood traditions appear across the world? The obvious answer is that floods happen everywhere. Rivers overflow, coastlines change, storms and tsunamis strike. A universal experience can produce universal myth. But that explanation does not fully account for the structure. Why the repeated motif of warning? Why a chosen survivor? Why a vessel built by instruction? Why the release of birds? Why the landing on a mountain? Why the flood as a boundary between ages? Diffusion is another answer. Stories travel via trade, migration, conquest. Mesopotamian flood narratives could influence neighboring cultures later. Through contact, the structure spreads. That certainly happened in some cases. Scholars have long noted parallels between Mesopotamian flood stories and later versions in the Hebrew tradition. Influence is real, and yet the deeper unease remains. How does a narrative skeleton persist even when the flesh changes? Names change, gods change, geography changes, but the sequence warning, vessel, deluge, survival, restart stays. If you allow yourself to speculate gently without turning speculation into certainty, another possibility emerges. That what persisted was not a story invented in one place, but a memory pattern carried by human groups that scattered, each adapting it into local language and theology, but preserving the rhythm of an event that felt like the end of the world. Even if the flood itself was regional, its effect on a connected civilization could feel total. If your entire world is built along river plains, if your trade routes, your food systems, your political centers are tied to those plains, then a regional catastrophe can destroy your sense of a world. It can end an era, and the survivors, if they move, if they resettle, if they rebuild, carry not just trauma, but structure. They carry the sense that time has a hinge, a pivot, before, after. This is why the Sumerian king list matters psychologically, even if its numbers are symbolic. Because the list is not merely about kings. It is about continuity. It is about the assertion that there was a world before the flood, and that after it, things became smaller. If you want a story to keep people listening until the end, you do not give them noise. You give them a quiet tension that slowly tightens. You make the audience feel that the ground under the oldest evidence is not solid. So let us tighten it, slowly. Consider the idea that writing itself, at least in its earliest standardized form, appears not as an invention, but as a deployment. As if someone already knew what writing should do, and the question was not how to invent it, but how to implement it quickly across a culture. Writing as an emergency technology. Writing as a response. Because if knowledge is threatened, you do not build a decorative script. You build a functional one. You standardize it. You teach it. You link it to math and calendars and law. You make it part of survival. You do not treat literacy as art. You treat it as infrastructure. This is exactly how scribal schools functioned. Learning to write meant learning to count. Learning to count meant learning to measure. Measuring meant predicting seasons, organizing labor, allocating food. The wedge marks on clay are not just words. They are a system of civilization made portable. And portability matters when the future feels uncertain. Now imagine another layer of unease, one that does not require lost continents or impossible machines. Imagine that the missing steps we do not see in the archaeological record are not missing because they never existed, but because they belong to materials that do not survive well. Wood, fiber, leather, papyrus. A long, slow development could have happened on perishable media, leaving little trace. That is plausible. But then another question rises. Why, at the moment we can finally see writing clearly, does it already behave like a mature administrative tool? Why is the earliest visible writing already confident? Perhaps because the first visible writing is not the first writing that ever existed. Perhaps it is the first writing that was engineered to survive. That is a terrifying thought, because it suggests a selection effect. Not that civilization began there, but that what survived began there. It suggests that what we call the beginning of history is not the start of human complexity, but the point at which someone decided to make memory durable enough to outlast a disaster. And once you see it this way, the museum objects feel different. They stop being old. They become warnings. A tablet is a message sent into a future that the writer cannot see, saying, "This mattered. This was how the world worked. Do not let it vanish completely." Now return to the first question, because it is time to let it deepen. What if the oldest cities are built not by pioneers, but by inheritors? Inheritors do not build from curiosity. They build from obligation. Inheritors rebuild what they have been told is necessary. They replicate alignments. They keep calendars. They preserve measurement units. They maintain the story of why kingship matters. They act as caretakers of a system older than their own lifetimes. And if they are the last survivors of a larger collapse, then their sense of time would be haunted. They would feel they live in the shadow of a before that no longer makes sense but still must be honored. This haunting is everywhere in Mesopotamian culture. The sense that order must be maintained, that ritual repetition is not decoration but repair, that the world can slip back into chaos if the proper forms are neglected. Even the New Year festival, Akichu, functions like a ritual reboot. The king is humbled. The order is restated. The cosmos is ray-stabilized. A culture obsessed with ray stabilization is a culture that remembers instability. So now, for a moment, imagine the flood not as a single historical event, but as a symbol of repeated interruption in human existence. Perhaps there were many interruptions. Perhaps the Mesopotamian flood was one of them, made famous because it struck a region that later preserved writing. Perhaps other collapses happened elsewhere and were not recorded in durable media. Perhaps the world has ended quietly more times than we can count, and each time, survivors carried fragments forward, tools, stories, measurements, until another collapse shaved the world smaller again. This is not a claim. It is a mood. It is the kind of mood that makes you look at an ancient city wall and wonder what it is built on top of, and what that earlier foundation was built on, and whether the line between ancient and forgotten is thinner than we like to admit. Because that line is exactly what the tablets suggest. They suggest that memory starts where writing survives, not where experience begins. So if you have ever felt, in your own life, that your memory begins only where you have records, photos, journals, messages, then you already understand this on a small scale. You know how vast a life can be, and how little of it becomes durable. Civilizations are the same. And Mesopotamia, with its clay and its rivers and its disasters, accidentally built an archive of human fear. Fear of forgetting, fear of discontinuity, fear that the world can pause and restart with less of itself intact. Now, let us move deeper into the museum again, because the museum is a strange place. It is quiet. It is controlled. It pretends that the past is stable because it is labeled and lit. But the past is not stable. A tablet behind glass is not a dead thing. It is an active transmission. It is an artifact that survived the failure of bodies. It is a piece of time that escaped time. Some of these tablets are purely administrative, lists of grain, wages, inventories. That seems dull until you realize what it implies. A society that tracks grain in detail has specialized labor. It has redistribution systems. It has officials. It has storage infrastructure. It has predictable calendars. It has enough stability to care about accounting. And then, threaded through the administrative records, are the mythic ones. The hymns, the epics, the stories of divine instruction. Modern minds often separate these categories, real records and myth. But to the people who wrote them, the categories were not separate. The divine was part of governance. The gods were part of the chain of legitimacy. The mythic stories were not entertainment, they were explanation, justification, and memory. If kingship descended, then it matters. If knowledge was given, then the duty of the scribes is not to invent, but to preserve. And preservation is what clay does. This is why, in the story of Inanna and the me, those divine principles of civilization, the me are treated almost like objects. Things that can be taken, moved, stolen, brought from one city to another. On one level, it is myth. On another, it is a memory of transfer. Knowledge treated as cargo. If knowledge can be cargo, then it can be rescued. If knowledge can be rescued, then someone expected it to be threatened. Let the thought settle. And now, imagine that the city you call the first city is actually the first city after the rescue. Not the first architecture, the first reconstruction. If so, then some of the most unsettling questions become quiet and simple. What was lost that made preservation necessary? How close did humanity come to a full erasure? And are we, even now, living inside the surviving fragments of older systems, mistaking inheritance for invention? We like to believe we are the first to know certain truths. We like to believe we discovered mathematics, mapped the sky, mastered time. But the deeper you look into the earliest recorded civilizations, the more you find that we did not invent so much as we continued. We inherited. And inheritance is not comforting, because inheritance implies ancestry. Not just biological ancestry, civilizational ancestry. It implies that there are layers below the layers we can see. It implies that the oldest things we have found are not necessarily the oldest things that existed. They are merely the oldest things that survived the right disaster in the right material. Clay is the survivor's medium. So here is a new way to interpret the ancient cities. Not as the dawn of civilization, but as a dawn after a long night. A dawn where the sky is clear again, but the air still smells like floodwater. A dawn where the survivors are competent because they remember. A dawn where the temples are rebuilt smaller, not because the builders lack intelligence, but because the world has fewer hands, fewer resources, fewer living specialists. A smaller world. A narrower world. A world that still uses the old measurements because they still work. If this interpretation is even partly true, then the oldest cities are not monuments to progress. They are monuments to recovery. Now let the story slow down again, because this is a sleep story, and sleep stories do not rush to conclusions. They do not need to prove. They need to unfold. So we return to the rivers. In the dark, the Tigris and Euphrates continue to move, as they did before cities and after them. They do not remember names. They do not care about kings. But they shape the plains, and they shape the human imagination, because they teach the same lesson repeatedly. A world that gives can also erase. And perhaps that is why the earliest written civilization in that region wrote as if it could not afford to forget. When the water rises, you can lose buildings in days. You can lose knowledge in a generation. The only way to fight that is to press memory into matter. And matter, in Mesopotamia, was clay. When we speak about the invention of writing, we often tell a clean story. Trade grew complex, people needed accounting, symbols evolved, then writing emerged. But another story is possible. Collapse happened, memory was endangered, and writing emerged as a defense. Not against ignorance, against oblivion. If you accept that, then the standardized nature of early cuneiform is not strange. It is expected. A defense must be reliable. It must be taught. It must be repeatable. It must be transferable. You do not build a defense by letting everyone improvise. You build a defense by making a system. And systems look mature because they are designed to be used, not admired. So the question becomes less about how did they invent this, and more about what pressure made this necessary. Pressure is invisible in artifacts unless you know how to read it. A flood layer is pressure. A sudden standardized script is pressure. A culture obsessed with restoring temples as before is pressure. A king list that insists on a vast before and a compressed after is pressure. A library buried under floors is pressure. A scribe writing written so it will not be forgotten is pressure. All of these are the fingerprints of a civilization that has seen something break. And now, if you are still listening, if the room around you is quiet, if the light is low, then you can let the final unease approach without resisting it. If the oldest cities were built by survivors, then we are not looking at humanity's first steps. We are looking at humanity's attempt not to fall again. We are looking at the second draft. And second drafts are haunted by what happened to the first. We do not know what the first was. We do not have its archives. We do not have its cities. We may have only echoes, stories of floods, myths of lost ages, sudden appearances of complex systems, careful restorations of patterns that feel older than the people maintaining them. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is sometimes evidence of a broken chain. And the oldest chain we can see begins, oddly, with a civilization that writes as if it is remembering. So perhaps the best way to end this chapter is not with an answer, but with an image. Not an image of a golden city. An image of a hand. A human hand, in lamplight, pressing a reed into clay. A small act. A quiet act. A desperate act, if you think about it long enough. Because that hand is trying to push memory into the future. It is trying to make something that can survive what humans cannot. It is trying to outlast water, outlast fire, outlast the weight of centuries. And if the hand belongs to a survivor, then the tablet is not merely a record of the present. It is a message from the edge of an ending, saying, we are still here. We are smaller now, but we remember enough to rebuild. And somewhere beneath the rebuilt streets, beneath the restored temples, beneath the careful numbers and the calm administrative tone, there is a silence that the tablets cannot describe. A silence before the first stone. A silence before the flood. A silence before the memories that even survivors could not carry across. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing of all. That the oldest writing we have is not the birth cry of civilization but the steady, controlled voice of someone who has already heard civilization die once and refuses to let it vanish completely again. And when you let that image linger, the hand, the clay, the quiet, you begin to notice something else that does not announce itself loudly. Civilizations that believe they are beginning tend to celebrate themselves. They carve triumphs into stone. They exaggerate their own novelty. They speak of firsts. Civilizations that believe they are continuing behave differently. They are cautious. They document. They repeat. They archive. They act as if the world is fragile. And fragility is written everywhere in early Mesopotamian culture, not as panic, but as discipline. The discipline of keeping things aligned. The discipline of counting correctly. The discipline of writing things down even when everyone involved already knows them. Because knowing is not the same as preserving. This distinction matters more than it seems. A society inventing something for the first time can afford to rely on memory. A society that has watched memory fail cannot. And memory does fail. It fails quietly. It fails one death at a time. Imagine a generation after a catastrophe, not one dramatic apocalypse, but a slow erosion. Elders die. Specialists disappear. Techniques that once felt obvious suddenly feel incomplete. Someone remembers how to calculate something, but not why it works. Someone else remembers the ritual, but not its original context. Someone remembers the words, but not the cadence. This is how civilizations bleed knowledge. Not all at once, but steadily. So the response is not innovation. The response is compression. You compress knowledge into forms that can be copied. You make procedures explicit. You turn intuition into instruction. You formalize what used to be implicit. And that is exactly what early Mesopotamian texts look like. They are not lyrical manuals of discovery. They are practical anchors. They assume prior understanding, but they insist on recording outcomes. They are written as if the writers know that the chain behind them might already be weakening. Consider the structure of scribal education. The earliest training tablets we find are not playful experiments. They are drills, lists, tables, repetitions. They are designed to imprint, not to explore. This is not how curiosity behaves. This is how preservation behaves. Now, slow down again, because the story does not need to rush toward revelation. The unease grows best when it grows naturally. Think about the way cities appear in the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia. They do not creep outward from villages in a messy, organic sprawl. They appear with defined zones, sacred precincts, administrative quarters, residential areas. That kind of organization requires foresight. It requires an abstract plan that exists before construction begins. Plans come from experience, and experience usually comes from repetition. So where did the repetition occur? One answer is obvious and comfortable. In the same place, earlier, but erased. Floodplains are terrible archives for early experimentation. They destroy lightly built structures. They churn layers. They swallow perishable materials. If earlier phases of urban development existed there, they would be among the hardest to recover. But another answer is quieter and more unsettling. The repetition may not have occurred there at all. It may have occurred somewhere else. Somewhere higher. Somewhere drier. Somewhere whose materials did not fossilize well. Somewhere whose people eventually migrated down into the floodplains, bringing with them not ruins, but systems. If that were the case, then the cities we call first are actually first in place, not first in existence. They are relocations. And relocation changes behavior. When people relocate after loss, they do not experiment freely. They reproduce what they know works. They cling to forms that feel proven. They value alignment over novelty. This mindset leaves traces. One of those traces is how time itself is treated. Calendars are not intuitive. They are negotiated systems between sky and ground. They require patience. They require watching the same cycles again and again, noticing discrepancies, correcting drift. A culture inventing a calendar from scratch would show roughness, misalignment, trial and error. But the earliest Mesopotamian calendars we can reconstruct are already stable enough to support agriculture, festivals, taxation, labor organization. That stability is suspicious not because it is impossible, but because it arrives without visible hesitation. It feels inherited, and inheritance always comes with loss. When something is inherited, it is rarely complete. It arrives with missing context, missing explanation. You receive the tool, but not the full story of its creation. This would explain something subtle but important. Why so many early texts explain what but not why? The scribes record outcomes. They record rules. They record alignments. They do not pause to philosophize about origins, as if origins were already beyond reach, as if asking why would open a door they did not want to open. Now, let us take one step deeper, because the story allows it. In later Mesopotamian philosophy, the world is understood as something that requires constant maintenance. Chaos is not defeated once it is held at bay through ritual repetition. Order is fragile. Boundaries must be reinforced. This worldview does not come from optimism. It comes from experience. A civilization that has never seen collapse imagines progress. A civilization that has seen collapse imagines cycles. This is why time, in Mesopotamian thought, does not stretch endlessly forward. It loops. It renews. It resets. And that looping is ritualized. The New Year festival reenacts cosmic order. Kings symbolically lose and regain authority. Temples are reconsecrated. The world is reminded how to exist. You do not do this unless you believe forgetting is dangerous. And forgetting is dangerous only if something important has already been forgotten once. Now imagine yourself standing in a ruined city mound thousands of years later. You dig down through layers of occupation. You find floors, hearths, broken pottery. Then suddenly, a layer of fine silt. No artifacts, no footprints, just silence. Then below that, another city. Different pottery, different layouts, different habits. That is not mythology. That is stratigraphy. And stratigraphy does not tell you what people felt. But texts do. Texts tell you that the flood mattered enough to divide history. Texts tell you that kingship had to be restored. Texts tell you that lifespans shortened. Texts tell you that the gods stepped back. Texts tell you that the world became narrower. Now, pause again, because something important is happening quietly in the background of this entire narrative. The people who wrote these texts did not describe themselves as innovators. They described themselves as caretakers. They did not say, "We discovered." They said, "We were given." They did not say, "We began." They said, "We restored." Modern readers often dismiss this language as religious metaphor. But metaphor does not emerge randomly. It grows from experience. If knowledge arrives suddenly, from teachers you do not fully understand, it feels given. If systems predate your own memory, they feel from above. If authority appears suddenly after chaos, it feels descended. Language reflects psychological reality. And the psychological reality of early Mesopotamia is not youthful exuberance. It is cautious continuity. Now let the quiet stretch a little longer. Because sleep stories do not need conclusions. They need depth. Imagine, for a moment, a future archaeologist studying our own civilization. Imagine that most of our digital records are lost. Hard drives decay. Servers collapse. Formats become unreadable. What survives? Stone, ceramics, metal, fragments of printed text. Imagine that this future scholar finds a city built on top of another city, with a gap between them. Imagine they find standardized units of time and space already in use. Imagine they find no record of the messy decades of development that led to those standards. What would they conclude? Perhaps they would say, "This civilization appeared suddenly." Perhaps they would argue about missing steps. Perhaps they would debate whether knowledge was inherited. Now reverse that perspective. That is us. We are the future archaeologists of summer. And we are staring at a civilization whose visible record begins already organized, already technical, already cautious. The simplest explanation is not the most dramatic one. It is the most human one. Loss. Loss does not erase everything. It compresses. It forces prioritization. It strips away ornament and leaves structure. And structure is what survives. So when we look at the earliest cities, perhaps we are not seeing humanity's first attempt at order. We are seeing humanity's decision not to lose order again. This reframes the question entirely. Instead of asking, how did they invent so much so fast? We ask, what made them afraid enough to preserve so carefully? Now let the story widen once more. Because this pattern collapse, survival, reconstruction, preservation does not belong only to the deep past. It belongs to every civilization that has faced interruption. Libraries burn. Languages die. Techniques vanish. And when they do, survivors rebuild not with creativity first, but with memory. They repeat. They conserve. They fear deviation. This fear is not weakness. It is wisdom purchased at a terrible price. So perhaps the most ancient cities are not monuments to progress, but monuments to restraint. They are cities built by people who knew that the world can disappear underwater, under fire, under time. People who knew that continuity is not guaranteed. People who wrote because speaking was no longer enough. People who measured because guessing had failed before. People who aligned temples because misalignment once meant catastrophe. This is not a story of lost gods or vanished super civilizations. It is a story of human fragility and human persistence. And that is why it endures. Now, as the pace slows further, imagine the final image. Not a flood, not a king, not a god. A room, low ceiling, cool air, rows of clay tablets stacked carefully in jars, labels pressed into wet clay, subjects separated, mathematics here, stars there, laws here, hymns there. A library designed not for beauty, but for survival. And on one tablet, scratched by a careful hand, a simple intention. Written so it will not be forgotten. Not written for glory, not written for power, written against silence. And perhaps that is where the oldest cities truly begin, not with walls, not with temples, but with fear of forgetting. A fear that turned memory into architecture. A fear that turned clay into time. A fear that still speaks, quietly, whenever we listen long enough. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over places where knowledge is stored for reasons no one wants to name. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of preparation. If you walk through the remains of ancient Mesopotamian cities not in the midday heat, but in the imagination, at dusk you begin to sense it. The streets are narrow. The walls are thick. The courtyards are inward-facing. These are not spaces designed to impress strangers. They are spaces designed to endure. Endurance shapes architecture. Endurance shapes language. Endurance shapes memory. The earliest cities do not feel like experiments. They feel like fortifications not only against enemies, but against erasure. Every baked brick, every measured angle, every repeated alignment is a quiet refusal to let something slip away again. This is why the idea of progress feels strangely absent in the earliest texts. There is no excitement about discovery, no celebration of novelty, no declaration of having finally figured something out. Instead, there is maintenance, lists, tables, standards, procedures. A civilization that thinks it is climbing does not write like this. A civilization that thinks it is standing on unstable ground does. And that ground both literally and metaphorically was unstable. Floodplains do not forgive memory. They rearrange it. They bury it. They smear it into layers that only later hands will struggle to separate. When water comes, it does not ask what is important. It takes what it touches. And when it leaves behind a smoothness that hides what was once detailed and alive. This is why the flood, in Mesopotamian thought, is never just water. It is smoothing. It is flattening. It is the loss of differentiation. Before the flood, the world is described as larger, looser, more fluid. Gods walk among humans. Kings rule for impossibly long spans. Boundaries blur. After the flood, everything tightens. Lifespans shorten. Roles become defined. Law becomes explicit. Ritual becomes regulated. Writing becomes relentless. This is not coincidence. It is adaptation. A world that has learned it can be erased does not tolerate ambiguity easily. It insists on clarity. It insists on record. It insists on repetition. Now imagine the psychology of the people living in that after. They are not living in a mythic dawn. They are living in a reduced world. A world with fewer people. A world with fewer specialists. A world with fewer direct answers. A world where the gods no longer speak openly. That absence matters more than any flood, because absence creates anxiety, and anxiety creates systems. Systems are how humans impose predictability on uncertainty. So they measure time. They measure land. They measure grain. They measure the sky. They reduce reality into units that can be checked, corrected, repeated. This is not curiosity. This is control. And control, in this context, is not arrogance. It is survival. Now consider how kingship changes. Before the flood, kings are described almost as beings of a different order, long-lived, semi-divine, closer to the gods than to ordinary humans. After the flood, kings are still powerful, still sacred, but unmistakably mortal. They need legitimacy. They need ritual confirmation. They need law. Authority becomes mediated. This shift tells us something profound. The world after catastrophe does not trust charisma alone. It needs documentation. It needs precedent. It needs rules that can survive the death of the ruler. This is why law codes appear. Not because humans suddenly decided to be fair, but because fairness without structure collapses when memory collapses. Law is memory externalized. And again, memory is the theme that refuses to leave. Now let the story drift gently outward, beyond Mesopotamia. Because once you notice this pattern collapse followed by obsessive preservation, you start to see it everywhere. In Egypt, monuments are built to last forever, but writing also becomes formalized early, tied to ritual, tied to order, tied to cosmic stability. In China, flood narratives frame the transition from mythic ages to historical rule, and engineering becomes sacred. In the Indus Valley, standardized weights and city planning appear with little visible developmental chaos. In Mesoamerica, cycles of creation and destruction structure time itself. Different landscapes, different gods, same anxiety, same response. Measure, record, repeat. Humanity does not respond to disaster by becoming imaginative. It responds by becoming careful. And careful cultures leave behind a specific kind of archaeology. They leave behind fewer experiments. They leave behind more standards. They leave behind systems that feel already finished when we first encounter them. Now let that thought sink deeper, because it changes how we interpret absence. Absence does not mean nothing was there. Absence often means something failed. And failure rarely leaves neat traces. So when archaeologists search for missing links and do not find them, it may not be because those links never existed. It may be because those links broke under conditions we do not fully understand. Conditions like water, fire, social collapse, migration, slow demographic decline. The kinds of things that erase nuance. The kinds of things that leave only what was deliberately made durable. And durability is not neutral. Durability reflects intention. Clay tablets survive because someone chose clay. Standardized scripts survive because someone enforced standardization. Archives survive because someone thought about the future. Someone thought, this might happen again. Now imagine the weight of that thought. Imagine believing not abstractly, but viscerally, that the world you know can end. That your children might inherit ruins. That your knowledge might vanish with you. What would you do? You would write. You would copy. You would teach repetition. You would distrust improvisation. You would value accuracy over creativity. You would train scribes not to invent, but to reproduce. And you would tell stories not of beginnings, but of endings and restorations. This is why Mesopotamian myths feel mournful. Even when they celebrate order, there is grief beneath it. The grief of knowing that order is not permanent. The grief of knowing that something greater once existed. The grief of knowing that memory itself is fragile. Now slow your breathing again, because we are nearing a deeper stillness. Picture the final scene not as a revelation, but as a quiet understanding. The oldest cities we know are not shouting at us. They are whispering. They are saying, we were not the first. We were not the last. We were the ones who tried to hold on. We were the ones who rebuilt smaller. We were the ones who wrote so it would not disappear completely. We were the ones who understood that time does not only move forward. It breaks. It resets. It narrows. And when it does, those who survive inherit not a blank slate, but fragments. Fragments that must be handled carefully. Fragments that must be respected. Fragments that must be repeated exactly, because deviation might mean loss. So perhaps the most honest way to see the ancient world is not as primitive, but as wounded. Wounded, yet disciplined. Wounded, yet precise. Wounded, yet determined to remember. And if that is true, then we are not living at the end of a long upward climb. We are living somewhere in the middle of a much longer cycle of forgetting and remembering. We still measure time the way they taught us. We still divide space with their geometry. We still build cities on top of older cities. We still write, store, archive now in materials we hope will survive what bodies cannot. We tell ourselves this is progress. But maybe it is something older. Maybe it is the same impulse. The impulse to leave something behind that will still speak when we cannot. And that is why, when you finally drift towards sleep, the image that remains is not dramatic. It is quiet. A tablet cooling after being fired. A shelf in a dark room. A mark pressed deliberately into clay. A human decision against oblivion. And in that decision, the realization that the oldest cities were not naive beginnings, they were careful continuations. Built by people who knew what it meant to lose a world and refused to lose its memory again. There is a moment, usually unnoticed, when history stops feeling like something that happened to other people and begins to feel uncomfortably close. It happens when the distance collapses, when the centuries between you and the past feel thin, when you realize that the people who pressed those marks into clay were not speaking to us, but to someone who might survive what they fear. And in that realization, the ancient world stops being ancient. It becomes familiar, because fear of forgetting is not an old fear. It is a human one. In the quiet hours before sleep, when the noise of the present finally recedes, the mind naturally drifts toward patterns. It looks for continuity. It tries to understand where it stands in the long chain of events that led here. And that is when the oldest cities begin to feel less like origins and more like interruptions. Consider the way the Sumerians understood their own place in time. They did not speak as people at the beginning of everything. Their texts do not celebrate novelty. They do not marvel at invention. Instead, they speak with a subdued certainty, as if the most important work had already been done before they arrived. Their role was to maintain, to preserve, to keep order intact in a world that had already proven capable of collapsing. This mindset permeates everything. Their laws are not experiments in justice, they are restorations of balance. Their temples are not creative expressions, they are reconstructions of an ideal form remembered from earlier times. Their myths do not glorify discovery, they explain loss. Even their gods behave differently after the flood. They become distant, less involved, more abstract. The direct intimacy between divine and human fades, replaced by ritual, mediation, structure. That change alone speaks volumes. A society that believes the universe is stable does not obsess over mediation. A society that has seen instability does. The flood, whether understood as a single event or a collective memory of repeated catastrophes, becomes the pivot around which everything else turns. It marks the moment when humanity learned that the world does not guarantee continuity. And once that lesson is learned, it is never unlearned. From that point forward, civilization becomes an act of resistance. Not resistance against nature, but resistance against forgetting. This is why writing appears not as a tentative gesture, but as a system. This is why mathematics is not playful, but exact. This is why astronomy is not speculative, but predictive. These are not luxuries. They are anchors. Anchors against drift. Time drifts if you do not measure it. Land drifts if you do not survey it. Memory drifts if you do not record it. And drift, to people who have already watched the world dissolve once, is unacceptable. So they fix the world in symbols. They fix it in numbers. They fix it in orientation. They fix it in repetition. This is the quiet genius of early civilization. Not invention, but stabilization. Now imagine the emotional weight of that task. To live in a world where the past feels larger than the present. Where the stories speak of kings who lived impossibly long lives, of cities that existed before memory itself could fully record them. Where the present feels like a reduced version of something more expansive. That is not a triumphant worldview. It is a mournful one. And mourning changes how people act. It makes them cautious. It makes them precise. It makes them patient. It makes them conservative in the deepest sense of the word. Conserving what remains. This is why early Mesopotamian civilization does not rush forward. It consolidates. It deepens. It builds downward as much as upward. Layer upon layer of temples, each one aligned to the same invisible axis, as if the builders were afraid that even a slight deviation might unmoor something essential. And beneath those temples, beneath the carefully maintained geometry, lies silence. Silence where earlier structures once stood. Silence where other lives unfolded. Silence that no text can fully recover. This silence is not empty. It is dense. It is the silence of erased context, of names never written, of knowledge that survived only partially. And the Sumerians knew this silence existed. They did not pretend otherwise. They placed it at the center of their cosmology. Creation, in their understanding, was not the emergence of something from nothing. It was the organization of something already there. The separation of chaos into form. The imposition of boundaries. This tells us something crucial. They did not imagine a pristine beginning. They imagined a reordering after confusion. And that imagination likely reflects experience. When a society experiences collapse, it does not dream of clean origins. It dreams of restoration. It dreams of a time when things made sense. And it works tirelessly to recreate that sense, even if only imperfectly. This is why the earliest cities feel both sophisticated and restrained. They know what to do, but they do not overreach. They operate within inherited limits. They build systems that can survive reduced conditions. They accept that the world is now smaller, and they adapt. This adaptation is visible even in scale. Monumental architecture exists, but it is measured. Ambition returns slowly. Nothing explodes outward immediately. This is not the behavior of a civilization discovering its power for the first time. It is the behavior of a civilization relearning caution. And caution leaves a distinct archaeological signature. It leaves behind order without excess, complexity without exuberance, knowledge without explanation. Now let the mind drift again, because this story is not meant to provoke anxiety. It is meant to soothe through understanding, to show that continuity exists even when beginnings are unclear, that humanity has faced loss before and responded not with chaos, but with care, that the impulse to record, to measure, to align, is not cold bureaucracy, but a form of hope. Hope that something can be carried forward. Hope that memory can be made durable. Hope that even if the world narrows, it does not vanish completely. This is why the clay tablets matter. Not because of what they say individually, but because of what they represent collectively. They represent a decision to externalize memory, to place it outside the fragile container of the human body, to trust matter more than flesh. And matter, once shaped, becomes a witness that does not age the way we do, a witness that can wait patiently beneath the ground until someone else is ready to listen. This is what makes archaeology feel intimate. You are not discovering objects. You are receiving messages delayed by millennia, messages that say, quietly, we were here, and we tried to remember. And perhaps that is why listening to these stories before sleep feels natural, because sleep itself is a kind of forgetting. A temporary erasure. Each night, consciousness dissolves. Each morning, it reassembles. In that sense, every human being reenacts the cycle that ancient civilizations feared: loss and recovery. And just as they built systems to ensure recovery, we build rituals around sleep. We darken rooms. We quiet noise. We tell stories. Stories that do not demand attention, but allow the mind to drift safely through uncertainty. This story does the same. It does not insist that the past was greater. It does not claim lost technologies or forgotten gods. It simply suggests that history is not a straight line, that it bends, that it breaks, that it resumes, and that what survives is not always what was best, but what was preserved most carefully. So if the oldest cities feel strangely complete when we first encounter them, perhaps it is because they were never meant to be beginnings. They were meant to be continuations. Acts of memory performed under pressure, quiet defenses against a silence that once swallowed everything. And if we listen long enough to let the urgency fade and the patterns remain, we may begin to understand that civilization is not defined by how it starts. It is defined by how it survives. And survival, more often than not, is quiet. It is careful. It is written in clay. And it waits. As the voice continues, the world outside becomes less important. The present loosens its grip, and what remains is not a question that demands an answer, but a feeling that asks to be acknowledged. The feeling that history is heavier than we think. Not heavier with facts, or dates, or monuments, but heavier with what did not survive. What was never written. What was remembered only long enough to be copied once and then faded. Civilizations often imagine themselves as builders of the future, but the earliest ones we can still hear imagine themselves as custodians of the past. This difference changes everything. It changes how cities are laid out. It changes how authority is justified. It changes how time itself is perceived. For the Sumerians, time was not an arrow moving forward into novelty. It was a river that could overflow, erase its banks, and then carve a narrower channel when it returned. The flood was not an interruption in history. It was a compression. Before it, the world felt wide. After it, the world felt constrained. And constraint breeds structure. Structure breeds repetition. Repetition breeds memory. This is why the oldest cities feel strangely quiet when imagined correctly. They are not loud with ambition. They are quiet with responsibility. Responsibility to keep the world functioning. Responsibility to remember what still works. Responsibility to pass on what cannot be rediscovered easily. Think of mathematics again, not as numbers on a tablet, but as trust. When a scribe writes a calculation, he trusts that someone else will read it and understand it. When that trust exists, it implies a shared intellectual inheritance. And inheritance implies time. Time before the scribe. Time before the tablet. Time before the flood. This is the tension that never resolves in early civilization. Knowledge appears older than the records that contain it. The records behave like copies, not originals. They feel like echoes. And echoes only exist if there was once a louder sound. Now let the image shift gently. Imagine an empty temple platform at dawn. No priests. No rituals. Just stone and dust. The orientation is precise. The corners align with invisible directions. The platform waits. It always waits. Because it was built to host repetition. Generation after generation, people stood here, believing that by standing in the same place, facing the same direction, saying the same words, they were holding something together. Not summoning gods. Holding the world together. This belief does not arise from superstition. It arises from memory of collapse. When things fall apart once, you learn that order is not automatic. It must be rehearsed. And rehearsals leave traces. They leave behind rituals that seem excessive to outsiders. They leave behind architectural conservatism. They leave behind legal formalism. They leave behind texts that repeat the same phrases across centuries. To restore as before, according to the ancient design, as it was in earlier times. These are not empty formulas. They are vows. Vows made by people who know that forgetting has consequences. Now think about how children were taught. Not through discovery, through copying. Tablet after tablet, the same signs, the same numbers, the same structures. Muscle memory, mental grooves. Knowledge carved not just into clay, but into minds. This is slow work, patient work. Work done by people who are not chasing novelty. Work done by people who are guarding a flame in the wind. And guarding implies danger. Danger remembered. Danger anticipated. Danger not spoken of directly. In many early texts, catastrophe is referenced obliquely, not described in detail, not relived, simply acknowledged as a boundary. Before, after, as if saying more would invite it back. This restraint is telling. Trauma often behaves this way. It is encoded, not narrated. It is structured, not described. The flood is everywhere in Mesopotamian thought, but rarely dwelled on. It is a fact, not a story. A line, not a spectacle. And after that line, everything tightens. Human life becomes shorter. Divine presence becomes distant. Law becomes precise. Time becomes measurable. The world becomes manageable, but only just. This is not a golden age. It is a careful age. And careful ages leave behind a particular kind of ruin. They leave behind foundations, not soaring structures. They leave behind systems, not singular marvels. They leave behind fragments that fit together too well to be accidental. Now let yourself consider something uncomfortable, but gently. If early civilization is already a recovery, then our modern idea of ancient is incomplete. What we call ancient may already be post-collapse. What we call primitive may already be refined. What we call the beginning may already be the middle. And that means the true beginnings lie beyond memory. Not because they were insignificant, but because they were not preserved. Preservation is not neutral. It selects. It favors certain materials, certain environments, certain intentions. Clay survives. Stone survives. But many things do not. Sound, gesture, teaching without writing, knowledge held in bodies. These die quietly. And when they die, they leave no clean absence. They leave distortions, echoes, hints, which is exactly what we see. Hints of advanced planning without visible training. Hints of astronomical precision without developmental records. Hints of mathematical confidence without early mistakes. Hints of memory without origin. This is not proof of lost worlds. It is evidence of lost continuity. And lost continuity is enough to explain the unease. Now return again to the present moment, to the listener, to the quiet room, to the sense that this story is not about proving something, but about easing something, easing the pressure to believe that everything must have a clear origin, easing the anxiety that uncertainty creates, because uncertainty is not failure, it is honesty. The ancient world was honest about uncertainty. It did not pretend to know everything. It organized what it knew. It preserved what it could. and it accepted that some things were already gone. This acceptance is strangely comforting. It tells us that humanity has faced not knowing before and survived, not by conquering the unknown, but by stabilizing what remained. This is why, when you let this story carry you towards sleep, it does not end with revelation. It ends with continuity, with the sense that even if beginnings are lost, meaning is not. Even if origins are silent, patterns remain. Even if memory fractures, fragments still connect. We are part of that connection. We are listeners now, but once, others were writers. They pressed marks into clay, not knowing who would read them. They trusted time, and time, imperfect as it is, delivered the message. Not whole, not complete, but enough. Enough to tell us that the oldest cities were built by people who remembered something we no longer fully can. People who lived after an ending. People who chose care over chaos, precision over exuberance, memory over invention. And that choice, repeated quietly across centuries, is what we call civilization. Not the first spark, but the sustained flame. Now let the flame dim gently. Let the voice soften. Let the questions rest. There is nothing left to solve tonight, only something to feel. That history is not behind us. It is beneath us, layered, compressed, waiting. And in that waiting, there is peace. Because what survived once can survive again. And what was remembered once can be remembered again. As long as someone is willing to listen. As the story continues, the weight of time no longer presses forward. It settles. It spreads out. It becomes something you are inside, rather than something you are looking at. At this point, it is no longer important to decide whether the ancient world remembered something literally, symbolically, or imperfectly. What matters is that it remembered at all. Memory is fragile. Civilization is fragile. And the act of remembering, when survival is uncertain, becomes an act of quiet defiance. The people who shaped the earliest cities did not live with the illusion that the world was stable. They lived with the awareness that it could break. And once something has broken once, it never truly feels permanent again. This is why permanence became sacred. Why stone replaced wood? Why clay replaced skin and fiber? Why repetition replaced experimentation? These were not aesthetic choices. They were survival strategies. Imagine a child in a scribal school. Not a prodigy, not a genius, just a child. Day after day, pressing the same wedge-shaped signs into soft clay. Over and over. The same numbers. The same tables. The same sequences. This was not education for creativity. It was education for continuity. Because creativity can be rediscovered. But systems cannot. Lose a system, and generations must relearn what once took centuries to refine. So the system was guarded, protected, reduced to essentials. This is why early knowledge feels compressed, dense, already finished. It is knowledge stripped of excess. Knowledge that survived selection. Only what mattered remained. Only what worked. Only what endured. And endurance shapes character. It shapes worldview. It shapes myth. The gods of early Mesopotamia are not gentle creators. They are administrators. They regulate. They measure. They assign roles. They set limits. They withdraw when those limits are breached. This is theology shaped by catastrophe, a cosmos governed not by endless growth, but by balance. Balance enforced. Balance restored. The flood, in this worldview, is not chaos. It is correction, a return to scale. After it, the world feels smaller, and small worlds require careful handling. This is why kingship changes. Before the flood, kings are vast. They rule for ages. They blur into myth. After the flood, kings are measured, counted, recorded, bound by law. They become accountable, not just to gods, but to records, to tablets, to memory. Writing becomes power not because it dominates others, but because it outlives them. A spoken command dies with the breath. A written one waits. It waits centuries if needed. This waiting is a form of patience that modern minds struggle to grasp. But ancient minds lived inside it. They expected delay. They expected loss. They expected rebuilding. This expectation is everywhere, if you know how to look. Cities built atop cities. Temples rebuilt on the same foundations. Laws reissued with the same phrases. Calendars corrected but never abandoned. Nothing is allowed to drift too far, because drifting leads to forgetting, and forgetting leads to collapse. The past, in this sense, was not behind them. It was beneath them, physically, mentally, spiritually. Every step taken in a city like her or Eridu was taken above older steps. Every prayer spoken echoed earlier prayers. Every calculation repeated an older calculation. Life was lived vertically through time, not horizontally toward novelty. And this vertical awareness creates a particular kind of humility. Not the humility of insignificance, but the humility of inheritance. You are not the first. You will not be the last. What you hold was given. What you pass on must be preserved. This ethic does not produce explosive growth. It produces resilience. It produces longevity. It produces civilizations that last longer than their monuments. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden beneath all of this. That the most successful civilizations are not those that innovate the fastest, but those that remember the longest. When memory breaks, everything else eventually follows. The flood is remembered not because of water, but because of what water erased. Continuity, connection, the illusion that tomorrow will resemble today. After that illusion is gone, planning becomes sacred, measurement becomes sacred, order becomes sacred. This is why numbers feel almost religious in early texts, why calendars are embedded in ritual, why geometry is embedded in architecture, why astronomy is embedded in kingship. Time itself becomes something to be tended, as if it could slip away again if neglected. Now, let this understanding soften into something quieter. You do not need to carry it forward actively. You do not need to solve it. You do not need to believe anything extraordinary. It is enough to sense that humanity has faced loss before. Deep loss, structural loss, loss that reshaped the way people thought, built, and remembered. And from that loss, something stable emerged. Not perfect, not eternal, but sufficient. Sufficient to endure, sufficient to teach, sufficient to reach us. Across millennia, across silence, across broken layers of earth. The tablets do not shout, they whisper. They do not explain everything. They insist on very little. They simply say, we were here after something happened, and we tried to keep things together. That is all. And perhaps that is enough. Because in a world that often feels overwhelming, remembering that others rebuilt after collapse can be grounding. It reminds us that civilization is not a straight ascent. It is a series of careful recoveries, each one quieter than the last, each one built on memory. As you listen now, letting the voice slow, the words thin, the images fade, you are participating in that same process. Receiving, holding, letting go. The story does not end. It simply rests, like a city beneath sediment, like a tablet in the dark, like a thought waiting to be remembered again. And in that waiting, there is calm, there is continuity, there is sleep.